The chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria glittered like frozen constellations. Above the grand ballroom music, floating through the air, violins weaving a silken thread that matched the clink of champagne flutes and the hushed conversations of New York's wealthiest elite. A sea of gowns shimmering with sequins and silk tuxedos, pressed to perfection diamonds catching the golden light, a world designed to impress and intimidate, where fortunes were measured not in millions, but in billions. In the corner of the vast hall, a young woman in a crisp black uniform balanced a silver tray heavy with crystal glasses. Ella Dawson, keeping her eyes low, careful not to trip, careful not to let the fatigue in her bones show on her feet. Since dawn, moving from one shift to the next, stitching together enough wages to pay for her brother's hospital bills. The smile she wore, polite but distant, practiced in the art of invisibility. To the guests she was no one, just another shadow that kept the party flowing. She paused by a marble pillar to steady the tray and rubbed her wrist discreetly, her body longing for rest, but her mind refusing to stop, calculating how much more overtime could she take before she collapsed, how many weeks before the hospital demanded another payment for her brother's surgery. The thought made her chest tighten as she lifted her chin, forcing her breathing into rhythm, reminding herself she could not afford to falter. At that very moment, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. Conversations hushed in a ripple, eyes turning toward the entrance. Alexander Grant had arrived, his name alone carrying the weight of empires. The 34-year-old billionaire who commanded Grant Holdings, an investment conglomerate that spanned continents, cutting a striking figure in a tailored navy suit. His presence both magnetic and intimidating, reporters whispering as they craned their necks, eager for a glimpse of his expression, eager for any sign of weakness. Only weeks earlier, his breakup with Victoria Hale, the icy queen of venture capital, had dominated headlines. Alexander's gaze swept across the room with the cool detachment of a man accustomed to control. Yet beneath that exterior was a storm he needed tonight to run smoothly. He needed the whispers about betrayal and scandal, to fade the cameras waiting for a statement, and if not words, then an image that suggested stability and composure. His board of directors demanding that he appear untouchable, that he remind the world who he was. Ella kept her focus on her tray, but she felt his approach before she saw it. The air around her thickening, a shift in gravity, pulling every eye as Alexander Grant walked straight past senators, tycoons and film stars heading toward the corner where she stood, the tray wobbling slightly in her grip. Surely he was not looking at her. Surely she was invisible as always. But then he stopped, towering above her, his eyes dark and intent. For a moment, the noise of the gala receded, the chandeliers blurring into distant stars. Ella raised her eyes reluctantly and met his unreadable eyes, cold, yet searching, like a man making a calculation with stakes no one else could comprehend. She swallowed hard, uncertain whether to curtsy, to apologize, to flee. Alexander leaned slightly forward enough that only she could hear him above the hum of music and voices. His words clear, deliberate, impossible to mistake. "Will you pretend to love me tonight?" Ella froze the tray, nearly slipping from her hands. She searched his face for irony, for cruelty, for some explanation, but his expression was steady around them. The richest families in America exchanged gossip and laughter, But for Ella, the ballroom had fallen silent, her pulse hammered in her ears. She thought of her brother in the sterile hospital room, the machines ticking time against his fragile heart. She thought of the bills stacked on her kitchen table, the unopened envelopes she could not bear to read. She thought of her own reflection each morning, the reminder of a dream she had abandoned to survive. And now this, a billionaire standing before her, asking for something absurd, impossible, and yet strangely within her reach. Alexander straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving hers to the watching crowd. It looked like a casual pause in his stride, a word exchanged with staff, but to Ella it was as if the ground had opened beneath her. Pretend to love him. Pretend to belong to this world of glass and gold. Pretend for one night that she was not drowning in debt and despair. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, mocking her disbelief. She wanted to laugh, to demand what kind of game this was, but the words caught in her throat, the question too outrageous, too unreal, and yet the sincerity in his tone made it impossible to dismiss. In that suspended moment, Ella realized that the night had shifted course. Whatever answer she gave would pull her into a story she could not yet imagine. The billionaire had made his shocking proposal, and the world seemed to wait for her reply. Ella Dawson's life had never been simple. Growing up in a run-down neighborhood of Newark, New Jersey, where the cracked sidewalks and graffiti-covered walls were constant reminders that dreams were luxuries few could afford. She had lost her parents young, her mother to illness, and her father to an accident on a construction site, leaving her as the reluctant guardian of her little brother Daniel, who had been born with a congenital heart condition. While other teenagers planned for prom nights and college tours, Ella was working double shifts at diners, cleaning houses on weekends, and trying to stretch every dollar to cover rent and groceries. Her dream of becoming an interior designer was put on hold indefinitely when Daniel collapsed during high school, and the doctors said he would need ongoing treatment, followed by surgery that carried a price tag far beyond anything she could imagine. And so Ella learned to hide her longing for a better life behind practicality, to keep her pride intact even as she scrubbed floors, and to smile through exhaustion because Daniel's laughter was worth more than any dream. What defined her was not just her struggle, but her refusal to surrender her dignity. She carried herself with quiet resilience, refusing to ask for charity. Never letting anyone treat her like a victim, her co-workers admired her toughness. But few knew how many nights she went without sleep, staring at overdue notices, or how many tears she swallowed when she saw Daniel pretending not to notice her sacrifices for Ella. Hope was a fragile ember she refused to let die, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. In contrast, Alexander Grant was born into a world where success seemed predetermined. Yet his life was no less complicated, the heir to a financial empire built by his grandfather. He had been raised in Manhattan's Upper East Side, educated at the best schools, fluent in the language of power. From the moment he could walk by the age of 34, he was the commanding CEO of Grant Holdings, a multinational conglomerate with stakes in technology, energy, and real estate. Newspapers chronicled his every move, investors hung on his words, and young executives measured themselves against his meteoric rise. But beneath the polished exterior, Alexander was a man scarred by betrayal. His relationship with Victoria Hale had begun as a corporate alliance between two rising stars of Wall Street. glamorous and enviable, but over time it became a battlefield of egos. Victoria was brilliant but ruthless, more concerned with appearances than sincerity, and when Alexander discovered she had been leaking information to rivals while maintaining the facade of devotion, the betrayal shook him to his core. Their very public breakup fed the tabloids for weeks, painting him as cold, unfeeling, and incapable of love. The board of directors demanded he focus on stabilizing the company. But in the quiet of his penthouse, Alexander felt the sharp loneliness of a man surrounded by wealth, yet devoid of trust. What united Ella and Alexander, though they came from worlds light years apart, was the invisible weight they carried. Ella bore the burden of survival and responsibility. Alexander bore the burden of power and isolation. She had little but gave everything she had. He had everything yet could not give his heart freely. Where Ella craved stability, Alexander craved authenticity. Where Ella hid her vulnerability under defiance, Alexander hid his pain under control. Both were prisoners of circumstance, neither willing to admit how badly they longed for someone who saw them beyond their masks. Their backgrounds set the stage for collision. A waitress who had abandoned her dreams for family, and a billionaire who had abandoned his heart for survival. Two lives on opposite ends of society, intersecting in the most unlikely of moments. And though Ella might not yet realize it, Alexander's shocking proposal was less about image and more about his desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be the one person who would not betray him. The silence between them after those impossible words stretched longer than the echo of the violins in the ballroom. Ella's mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just heard, her throat tight, as she whispered back that he must be joking. But Alexander's eyes held no hint of amusement. Instead, there was calculation and a flicker of something that looked dangerously like need. He told her in a low voice that he needed someone unlike anyone else in this room, someone who could disarm the press and silence the whispers that had been gnawing at his reputation. Since the scandal with Victoria, his board demanded stability. His investors demanded confidence and the image of a new relationship with a woman no one expected could buy him exactly. That he explained it with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use to describe a merger, yet his gaze never wavered from her. Ella almost laughed at the absurdity. She was a waitress in borrowed shoes carrying a tray of champagne, not the kind of woman billionaires paraded before flashing cameras. She told him flatly that she could not be bought, her voice trembling but steady enough to make her point, and in that instant Alexander's expression shifted. The mask of cold detachment cracked as surprise flickered across his features. Most women leaned toward him when he spoke, not away. And here she was, daring to resist. He leaned closer again, lowering his tone further, so no one else could hear, saying that he could take care of her brother's surgery through his foundation, that he could arrange it without her name ever being mentioned. All she had to do was stand beside him tonight, smile when the cameras flashed, and let the world believe that she mattered to him. Ella's breath caught because the mention of Daniel pierced straight through her armor. She demanded to know how he even knew, suspicion flashing through her eyes. And Alexander admitted that his team had done research on every staff member at the gala to prevent leaks. His voice careful, not apologetic, but deliberate, as if he wanted her to understand that he left nothing to chance. For a moment, anger burned hot in her chest at the idea of her private pain being just another data point. But then Daniel's pale face rose in her mind and she wavered. She told him she would never sell herself for money, her pride intact, even as desperation threatened to unravel it, and Alexander's jaw tightened. Something about her refusal seemed to ignite his respect rather than his contempt. Finally, he offered not money but terms, a partnership of convenience, a performance with boundaries. She would not belong to him, she would not owe him beyond tonight. But in exchange, he would cover Daniel's immediate medical expenses. Through a charitable trust he already supported, she would owe him nothing personal, only her time and presence. Ella's heart pounded as she weighed the impossible choice, her instincts screaming to run, yet her brother's fragile life chaining her to the moment. After a long silence, she looked him in the eye and said, "I will pretend, but I will not sell myself." And Alexander, the man who had broken deals worth billions without flinching, found himself stunned by the steel in her voice. A slow smile curved his lips, not mocking but approving, as if her defiance had given him exactly what he had been searching for. He nodded once, sealing the arrangement, not with a contract, but with the meeting of their eyes. He told her the car would pick her up tomorrow afternoon, that she would be transformed to fit the role, and that for one night she would not be a shadow, but the woman the entire city whispered about. Then he stepped back, lifting his head with the practiced grace of a man who had already reclaimed control, leaving Ella breathless against the marble pillar, clutching her tray like a shield. The music swelled again. The conversations resumed, but nothing would ever be the same. That night, as Ella walked home through the neon-washed streets of New York, she replayed every word, every look, her shoes pinching her tired feet, her uniform clinging with the scent of spilled champagne. She hated herself for considering his offer, yet she knew she would do it, not for him, not for the glittering empire he embodied, but for Daniel, who deserved a future beyond the confines of hospital walls. She whispered to the empty street that she was strong enough to face whatever came, even if it meant stepping into a role she had never imagined. Meanwhile, Alexander sat in the back of his limousine, staring out at the city lights, his reflection merging with the skyline, wondering why he had chosen her out of all the possibilities in the room, telling himself it was strategy, that the shock value of bringing an unknown woman into his world would serve its purpose. But beneath the logic he felt the stirring of something unfamiliar, a curiosity that unsettled him. He remembered the way she had refused him with fire in her eyes, the way her voice did not bend to his wealth, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to consider that perhaps this arrangement would not be as simple as he intended. The next afternoon, Ella stood in front of the ornate glass doors of a Fifth Avenue townhouse that looked nothing like the world she belonged to. The building rose in elegant symmetry, with stone lions guarding the steps and curtains that whispered of privacy worth millions. She hesitated, clutching her worn handbag, before the door opened and a woman with sleek hair and a headset ushered her inside. The townhouse was not a home, but a preparation suite, a carefully designed cocoon where ordinary women were sculpted into figures who could stand beside power. Without faltering, stylists swarmed around her with polite precision, measuring, fitting, murmuring about fabrics and colors as if she were clay to be molded. Ella wanted to shrink back, But she remembered her promise to Daniel and forced herself to remain still, hours blurred, as they draped gowns across her shoulders, adjusted the fall of her hair, painted confidence onto her face, with strokes of makeup. By the time she turned toward the mirror, she barely recognized herself gone. Was the tired waitress in stiff shoes in her place stood a woman in an emerald silk gown that shimmered under the light, her hair swept into waves that framed her cheekbones, her eyes outlined in subtle shadow that made them glow with quiet fire. She touched her reflection with disbelief, whispering to herself that it could not be real. Alexander arrived just as the final touches were complete, his entrance commanding yet casual, the room pausing instinctively as if the air itself recognized him. He stood for a moment, taking in the sight of her, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of something passed through his eyes. He approached and told her simply that she looked exquisite, his voice carrying the authority of truth rather than flattery. Ella flushed and muttered that she felt like an imposter, to which he replied smoothly that everyone in their world was pretending something tonight. Her only task was to do it better than anyone else. He offered his arm, and though her instinct was to resist, she placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. The fabric of his suit smooth and cool beneath her fingers. The gesture small yet monumental. The ride to the event was silent at first, Ella staring out at the blur of Manhattan streets, while Alexander reviewed a briefing on his tablet. Finally he glanced up and began to explain the night ahead, the names she might hear, the questions she might be asked, the way cameras would capture every glance between them. His tone was calm but firm, as though he had rehearsed 1,000 negotiations. Yet when she admitted softly that she was terrified, he closed the tablet and looked at her directly, telling her that fear could be disguised as poise if she held her head high, that she should remember. No one could take away the strength she had earned through her struggles. His words surprised her, not because of their content, but because they felt personal, as if he had glimpsed through her armor. The car rolled to a stop before a grand museum where a charity gala spilled across marble steps, flashbulbs bursting in white light as reporters shouted questions. Alexander stepped out first, his frame cutting a path through chaos. Then he turned, extending his hand to help Ella emerge. She hesitated under the assault of cameras, but the steadiness in his eyes anchored her. She placed her hand in his, and together they ascended into the storm of attention. Whispers ignited instantly. Who is she? Where did she come from? The hashtag billionaire, mystery girl beginning to trend within minutes. Ella kept her chin up as instructed, though her heart thundered when a reporter shouted. Asking her name, Alexander answered smoothly, introducing her as someone very important to him, his tone daring anyone to question. Further, the crowd gasped at the implication. Ella forced her lips into a serene smile, and for a moment believed she could survive this charade. Inside the museum ballroom, chandeliers rained down light across marble floors. Polished to mirror perfection, music swelled from a live orchestra society's elite, clustered in jeweled circles of conversation. Yet the focus shifted wherever Alexander and Ella moved. He guided her with a subtle hand at her back, every gesture calculated to broadcast intimacy. At one point, he leaned close to whisper instructions, his breath brushing her ear and sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. She cursed herself for reacting, but his soft chuckle told her he had noticed. Soon they were on the dance floor, a waltz beginning, as if the orchestra had been waiting for them. Alexander's hand slid into hers, his other settling at her waist, guiding her steps with effortless control. Ella stumbled at first, then found herself carried by his rhythm. Their eyes locked, the world narrowing until she forgot about the cameras, the whispers, the pretense. She only felt the warmth of his touch and the strange safety in his presence. When he told her quietly that she was doing perfectly, she almost believed she belonged. Across the room, Victoria Hale watched with narrowed eyes, her crimson gown sharp as a blade, the sight of Alexander with another woman burning like acid. Though Ella did not know it yet, she had already made an enemy, one who would stop at nothing to reclaim the image she had lost. But for this night, Ella was untouchable, every glance, every photo, every headline framing her as the mysterious new partner of one of the most powerful men in the country. She returned to the limousine hours later, exhausted but strangely exhilarated, and as she leaned back against the leather seat, she realized that the lines between pretending and living had already begun to blur. The days that followed unfolded like scenes from a dream Ella could not quite believe belonged to her life. Instead of carrying trays through crowded restaurants, she now walked beside Alexander through marble lobbies and glass towers, his presence commanding attention in every room, while hers quietly disarmed it at a private dinner with potential investors. She listened as sharp-tongued men tried to undermine him, only for Alexander to cut through with calm authority. Then, when the conversation turned unexpectedly to architecture, she found herself speaking up, describing how space influenced emotion. Her words drawing thoughtful nods, Alexander's gaze lingering with something like pride as he gently placed his hand over hers beneath the table. A small gesture meant to reassure, a gesture that sent heat spiraling through her, despite the charade they were supposed to maintain. In another moment, at a board meeting where tension ran high over a risky acquisition, one director sneered at Ella's presence, whispering that she was nothing more than a pretty distraction. Alexander's voice cut sharp across the room as he declared that anyone questioning her place was questioning his judgment. The silence that followed was thick with shock. Ella sat frozen, her pulse hammering, realizing he had not only defended her, but elevated her in front of men who bowed to no one later when she whispered that he should not risk his reputation for her. He responded with quiet conviction that protecting her was not a risk, but a choice. His eyes dark and steady, in a way that made her chest ache with a feeling she dared not name. One evening he brought her to his penthouse, a vast space of glass and steel, high above the city, filled with art and silence. She wandered through the rooms, marveling at the view, until she discovered a piano tucked in one corner, its surface polished but the keys untouched. Alexander appeared behind her, his expression shadowed as he admitted it had belonged to his mother, who had loved music, but after her death he had never found the heart to play again. Ella's instinct was to touch the keys lightly. Coaxing a single note into the still air, she urged him to try. Just one song at first, he resisted, but finally he sat beside her, his hands tentative, then steady, as he played a fragment of memory, his face softening with something vulnerable. When he stopped, she whispered that his mother would be proud. The silence that followed was heavy with intimacy, a closeness deeper than any staged performance, his hand brushing against hers on the bench, sending sparks neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Public appearances became easier as their rhythm deepened, the world fascinated by the mystery of Ella. Social media flooded with images of her, in elegant gowns, her eyes always lifted toward Alexander, with a mixture of wariness and admiration. What the world did not see were the stolen moments behind closed doors, when she made him laugh with stories of Daniel's mischief, or when he silently pressed a blanket around her shoulders. After a long night, she began to notice how his armor slipped in private, how his laughter was richer when unguarded, how his silences were heavy with secrets he was not yet ready to share. And he began to notice the strength behind her fragility, the way she never complained about exhaustion, the way she carried her brother's burden with a quiet nobility that no amount of money could buy. Yet even as the chemistry burned brighter, both fought to deny it. Alexander reminding himself that she was only here because of an arrangement. Ella reminding herself that he was a billionaire whose world could crush her without meaning to. Still the night stretched longer. The touches lingered, the lines blurred. Until one evening, as they returned from a gala, he leaned against the car door, studying her face under the glow of city lights. His voice low as he told her she made him forget the performance. She laughed nervously, insisting it was just part of the act, but when he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, her breath caught for an instant. She leaned into his touch before pulling back, whispering that she could not lose herself in something that was not real. Alexander's jaw tightened as if fighting an impulse, his voice rough when he told her that maybe it was already real. Whether they admitted it or not, she turned away, unable to respond, her heart racing with fear and longing all at once. The arrangement that had begun as convenience was transforming into something far more dangerous, a bond neither could control, a fire lit between two people, from worlds apart, each step closer, threatening to consume the fragile boundaries they had promised to keep intact. And though both told themselves it was still pretend, their hearts had already begun to betray them. The illusion of perfection began to splinter. One afternoon, when Ella arrived at Grant Holdings for a charity luncheon, meant to showcase Alexander's softer side, photographers lined the marble lobby, snapping pictures as they entered arm in arm, her gown understated but elegant, his suit immaculate as always, but beneath the polished facade, tension simmered. Questions were growing sharper, reporters whispering about Ella's mysterious background, tabloids speculating that she had appeared out of nowhere, some claiming she was an actress hired to distract from his scandal, others insisting she was a gold digger clever enough to ensnare a billionaire. Ella tried to ignore it, lifting her chin and focusing on her breathing the way Alexander had coached her. But the murmurs stung, especially when she overheard one woman sneer that Ella's hands were too rough to belong to anyone raised in wealth. At the luncheon table, a bold journalist raised his voice above polite chatter, asking Alexander directly if he could confirm whether the beautiful young woman at his side had been vetted or if she was simply another attempt to repair his image after Victoria Hale. The room went still, all eyes watching for the crack that might reveal truth. Alexander's hand tightened over Ella's as he answered smoothly that anyone questioning Ella's presence was questioning his own integrity, that she was with him because she belonged with him, his tone calm but edged with steel. The journalist flushed and turned away, but Ella felt the shock of his public defense pulse through her, a warmth spreading in her chest even as doubt whispered at the edges. Because later, when they were alone in the limousine, his silence pressed heavy between them. She studied him in the dim light, her voice soft, as she asked if he really believed his own words, or if he had just been protecting his empire. Alexander exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the skyline rather than her. He admitted that sometimes he did not know where the line was anymore between performance and reality. The words struck like a blade, and Ella's throat tightened as she whispered, if that meant she was nothing more than a convenient image. His silence then was louder than any denial, and she turned toward the window, blinking back tears. The city lights smearing like watercolor against the glass. Over the next days, the tension only grew, paparazzi hounding. Her steps, online forums tearing apart blurry photos of her past, some digging into her waitressing jobs, others speculating about her brother's illness. Ella's pride flared at the invasion, her stomach twisting, with the knowledge that Daniel might be mocked for circumstances beyond his control. She confronted Alexander one evening, demanding to know if this was worth the cost, if his empire was more important than her dignity. His reply was clipped that empires were built on perception, and perception was fragile, that if she could not handle the pressure, then perhaps this arrangement had gone too far. The words sliced through her cold and merciless. She stormed out of his penthouse, trembling with rage and hurt, whispering to herself that she would not let herself be destroyed by a world she never asked to enter. The following weekend, at a glittering fundraiser hosted by a senator's wife, the crack widened further, Ella standing beside Alexander as donors paraded past each handshake and smile another performance, until one elderly woman leaned close with false sweetness and asked if Ella was enjoying playing dress-up, calling her a charming little actress. Ella froze humiliation, burning hot, but before she could respond, Alexander pulled her closer with a protective arm, declaring that she was far more than anyone in the room could ever understand. The crowd laughed nervously, cameras flashing, but once again, the performance had a cost, because afterward Ella cornered him in the marble hallway, demanding to know if he truly saw her as more, or if this was just another clever line to silence gossip. His expression hardened, his voice low, as he admitted he could not keep fighting everyone forever, that maybe she did not belong in this world. The cruelty of those words broke something fragile inside her, and she whispered through tears that she had never wanted this world in the first place, that she had only wanted to save her brother before turning and walking out into the cold night air, the sound of her heels fading like the crack of something breaking open. That was the first real fracture in their fragile bond, the moment when doubt outweighed desire, when pride collided with vulnerability, leaving both shaken Alexander retreating into silence and Ella retreating into pain, neither willing to admit that what they had built was already too precious to lose. The scandal erupted like wildfire on a Tuesday morning when Ella was barely awake, her phone vibrating endlessly on the nightstand of her small apartment. She fumbled to answer, only to hear the panicked voice of her coworker from the hotel, warning her not to go online. Confusion turned to dread as she opened a news app and was greeted by her own face plastered across headlines. The words splashed in bold capitals, "Mystery Girl." Exposed beneath it, a grainy video clip played on loop, showing Ella in her waitress uniform weeks earlier, accepting an envelope from a hotel guest in the service corridor, the footage cropped and twisted to look like a secret transaction, the commentary framing her as an escort paid to play the role of Alexander Grant's girlfriend. Ella's stomach dropped. She recognized that night the envelope had held nothing more than tips collected from a private party, but the angle, the timing, and the deliberate captions told a different story, one designed to humiliate. By noon, every outlet from gossip blogs to financial news stations was running the piece. Hashtags spreading like poison, calling her a fraud, a gold digger, an actress hired by a billionaire, desperate to distract from his breakup with Victoria Hale. Ella's hands shook as she scrolled through thousands of comments filled with venom strangers dissecting her appearance, her family even speculating that Daniel's illness was a fabricated sympathy ploy, her chest constricted with rage and helplessness as tears blurred her vision. The calls came next, her landlord demanding to know if she could still pay rent now that she was out of work, her manager at the hotel telling her not to bother returning the hospital's billing office, politely reminding her that overdue payments would need to be resolved immediately. Ella pressed the phone to her chest as if she could block out the world, but the humiliation seeped into every corner. Daniel tried to comfort her, but his pale face only deepened her guilt. She had promised him safety, and instead she had delivered scandal. Across the city, Alexander's office buzzed with chaos. His public relations team scrambling his board members, furious investors questioning his judgment, Victoria Hale's name suddenly resurfacing in interviews. As commentators speculated, she had been right all along about his recklessness. Alexander slammed the conference table, demanding silence, his jaw set as he declared that the footage was misleading, that Ella was not what they claimed, but his advisors pressed harder, asking if he could really be sure. After all, who was she? Where had she come from? What if she had indeed seen an opportunity and seized it? The seed of doubt slithered into his chest, though he fought it that evening when Ella arrived, desperate for reassurance. He met her with eyes shadowed by suspicion. She begged him to believe her, swearing that she had never betrayed him, that the envelope was just tips, her voice raw with desperation. But Alexander hesitated, his silence more brutal than accusation. Finally, he asked if she had ever lied to him about anything, his voice sharp with restrained fury. And though she answered no without hesitation, the damage was already done. Ella saw it in his expression, the flicker of mistrust that cut deeper than outright rejection. Their argument spiraled in his penthouse, under the glittering city lights. Ella accusing him of caring more about his reputation than her Alexander, retorting that one scandal could topple billions in investments. His words cold and clipped like a weapon, she shouted that she was not a commodity to be traded, that she had given everything for Daniel, and had risked her dignity for him. Her voice breaking as she demanded why he had chosen her if he could not trust her. His reply was quiet, but devastating, because you were different, but maybe I was wrong. Those words shattered her resolve. Ella stared at him through a veil of tears before whispering that she would not stay where she was unwanted. She grabbed her coat and stormed out into the night, her body trembling with fury and heartbreak, the click of the door behind her sealing the fracture wide open. Alone in the penthouse, Alexander pressed his hands against the glass window, staring down at the glowing city, the weight of his empire pressing against his chest, his mind torn between anger and regret, between loyalty to the truth he could not yet prove and the trust he had failed to give. Meanwhile, the media frenzy intensified television anchors, replaying the clip with mocking commentary. Victoria appearing at a charity event, smiling slyly as she told reporters that Alexander had always been reckless with his choices. The implication clear she had orchestrated this strike, but Ella had no way of proving it. She walked the streets numb to the cold, the sound of her name twisted into poison. Following her from glowing screens in shop windows, she felt stripped bare, her pride shredded, her heart broken not by strangers, but by the man she had almost begun to believe could see her worth. That night she sat alone in the darkness of her apartment, clutching Daniel's medical forms, her tears falling silently, whispering that she had ruined everything, that she should never have stepped into Alexander's world, unaware that this was only the beginning of a battle that would test not just her love, but her very survival. The days after the scandal broke felt like drowning for Ella. She avoided calls from reporters, avoided social media, and tried to shelter Daniel from whispers at the hospital. But her own spirit sagged under the weight of humiliation. Then one evening, while delivering takeout to make a few extra dollars, she found herself inside a luxury hotel where Alexander's board members were hosting a private dinner. She kept her head down, but as she passed a half-open conference room door, she overheard voices sharp and urgent. Curiosity made her pause, and what she heard froze her in place. Victoria Hale's distinctive tone slicing through the air, as she told a group of men that the scandal had done its job, that Alexander's reputation was sufficiently tainted for them to proceed with their plan to force a vote of no confidence. Ella pressed closer, straining to hear, as Victoria laid out documents showing falsified reports, secret accounts, and a plan to frame Alexander for insider trading that would strip him of control over Grant Holdings. Ella's heart pounded as she realized the scandal had been a setup all along, a carefully crafted distraction to weaken him before the real strike. She slipped away unnoticed, but not before snatching a folder, left carelessly on a side table inside, were copies of transactions and emails that clearly implicated Victoria and her allies' proof that could exonerate Alexander if only he would believe her. For hours she debated whether to risk going to him. Part of her screamed that he would only doubt her again, that he had already shown his mistrust, but another part reminded her that this was bigger than pride. This was his future, his company, and perhaps even his life. If enemies this ruthless succeeded, finally she boarded a train to his headquarters, clutching the folder so tightly her knuckles whitened. She arrived at dawn, the glass towers gleaming coldly against the pale sky. Alexander himself walked through the lobby with his security detail, looking exhausted, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot when he saw her. His stride faltered disbelief, flickering across his features. She approached trembling but determined, and said simply that she had proof he tried to dismiss her. At first, his voice edged with bitterness, but she thrust the folder into his hands, telling him to look for himself. When he flipped through the documents, his face changed, first skepticism, then shock, then a quiet rage that hardened into resolve. He whispered that this could destroy Victoria and save the company. Then his gaze lifted to Ella with something raw in his eyes. something that seemed to ask why she had come back after everything. Ella's voice shook as she told him she could not stand by and watch him be ruined. Not when she knew the truth, not when Daniel had always believed Alexander was a good man. Despite what the world said, she admitted she still hated him for doubting her, but she would not let that hatred outweigh what was right. For the first time, Alexander was silent, not because he did not believe her, but because he was overwhelmed by the force of her courage. He realized that while his board, his ex-lover, and even the press played games with lies, Ella had risked everything to bring him the truth. Within hours, Alexander convened his legal team evidence, compiled and presented to regulators the coup Victoria had orchestrated. Collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof, investors who had been ready to abandon him reversed course. Grant holdings stabilized, and whispers shifted to admiration at how he had exposed betrayal at the highest levels yet. Alexander knew he had not done it alone. It was Ella who had saved him. Ella who had walked back into his life with fire in her eyes and risk in her hands. She had become not a victim of scandal, but the catalyst for his redemption. That night, as the city lights flickered against his penthouse windows, he stood before her with gratitude heavy in his chest, his voice low as he admitted he owed her more than an apology, that she had given him back his company, his dignity, and perhaps even his heart. Ella looked away, blinking back tears, whispering that she had not done it for his empire, but because somewhere deep down she still believed he was worth saving. In that moment, Alexander Grant, billionaire, untouchable to the world, realized that the one person who had nothing to gain had been the one to give him everything he needed. Alexander had weathered hostile takeovers, collapsing markets, and betrayal from people he had once trusted, yet nothing compared to the storm raging in his chest. As he stood facing Ella in the quiet corner of a cafe, far removed from boardrooms and gala halls, he had asked her to meet him there, not as part of a strategy, but because he needed a space stripped of pretense. No chandeliers, no reporters, no masks, just the two of them and the raw truth that had been building since the moment he first asked her to pretend. Ella sat across from him, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. Her eyes wary but not cold. She had saved him, and yet he could still see the hurt he had inflicted etched into the lines of her face. He began slowly, his voice rougher than he intended, as he told her he had made the mistake of doubting her when she had given him no reason, to that he had been so scarred by betrayal that he had punished her for wounds she never caused. Ella looked down, whispering that his mistrust had cut deeper than the gossip ever could, because she had begun to believe he might see her as more than a role. Alexander reached across the table, taking her hand in his touch steady, his words deliberate, telling her he would not let pride destroy what had already changed him, that he would trade every dollar and every empire, if it meant keeping the one woman who had shown him what it meant to be truly seen. Ella pulled her hand back. At first, fear warring with the longing in her heart, she reminded him of the cost, how her brother had been mocked, how she had been stripped bare before strangers, how she had been left to carry shame alone, while he questioned her loyalty. Alexander nodded, his eyes burning with regret. Then, without hesitation, he stood dropped to one knee in the center of the cafe, drawing startled glances from other patrons, his voice carrying not arrogance, but vulnerability, as he declared that he did not want her to pretend any more. that he wanted her for real, for always, that he would not trade her for any empire or reputation. The cafe fell silent, except for the sound of his confession. Ella's breath caught tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered that she could not trust grand gestures, that she needed proof, not performance. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out documents, not of business, but of his resignation from the deal that would have secured billions, yet tied him to the very board members who had tried to destroy him. He told her he had walked away because no victory mattered if he had to lose her to win it. Ella stared at the papers, stunned the weight of his sacrifice, hitting harder than any words. Slowly she rose and crossed to him, lifting him from the floor, her hands trembling as she admitted that against all reason she still loved him, that she had tried to bury it under anger, but it had grown too strong to deny. The cafe erupted in applause from strangers who did not know their story, but recognized love when they saw it. Alexander held her close, whispering that from this moment there would be no more doubt, no more pretending. In the days that followed their reunion became the talk of the city photos of their embrace, spreading across social media with hashtags that painted her not as a fraud, but as the woman who had saved a billionaire public perception. Shifting dramatically, reporters now calling her courageous investors, praising Alexander for exposing corruption, but for Ella and Alexander. The noise faded compared to the quiet nights they spent rediscovering each other. She would sit beside him in his penthouse, listening as he spoke of his mother's music, his childhood fears, secrets he had never entrusted to anyone, and he would sit in her tiny apartment eating takeout on chipped plates, laughing at Daniel's jokes, discovering that happiness was not in palaces but in presence. Slowly, Ella's walls lowered as she realized he was not simply a man of wealth, but a man willing to strip it away for love. And Alexander's heart healed as he realized that trust was not given to titles or power, but to the woman who had stood by him even when he had failed her. One evening, as they walked along the Brooklyn waterfront, the city glowing behind them, he stopped suddenly, turning to her with a seriousness that made her breath still. He told her he had one more truth to confess, that for all the arrangements and scandals and public battles, the moment that had changed him had been that first night at the gala, when she had looked him in the eye and said she would pretend but never sell herself. He admitted that her strength had ignited something he could not put out, and that from that instant he had known she was not just a convenient image, but the one person who could break through the fortress he had built. Ella's lips trembled as she whispered that she had been terrified of him, then that she had thought he would crush her spirit, but instead he had given her back her courage. They kissed under the stars, not as billionaire and poor girl, not as image and scandal, but as two people who had clawed through doubt and pain to find each other on the other side. Their redemption was not in proving the world wrong, but in proving to each other that love could survive betrayal, fear, and fire. And for the first time since her parents' death, Ella allowed herself to believe that maybe she was no longer fighting alone. 6 months later, the seasons had shifted from the bitter chill of scandal to the warm bloom of a spring that felt like rebirth. Ella stood in the sunlit courtyard of a quiet garden tucked behind a brownstone in Brooklyn, her hands smoothing the fabric of a pale ivory dress that was simple yet elegant. Nothing like the gowns she had once worn on Alexander's arm at glittering galas. This was different. This was hers around her rows of white roses, and climbing ivy framed the space with intimate beauty. Only a handful of guests gathered Daniel in a neat suit, beaming with health. After his surgery, a few close friends who had stood by her when the world had mocked her, and Alexander's sister, who had flown in from Europe with tears already in her eyes. There were no flashing cameras, no reporters, no board members. Whispering behind champagne glasses, only family love, and the quiet certainty that what they were about to promise had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with truth. Alexander waited at the end of the aisle in a tailored navy suit. Not the armor of a CEO, but the attire of a man ready to start a life, with the woman who had saved him, his eyes never leaving hers. As she walked slowly toward him, every step, a reminder of how far they had come from that shocking proposal at the Waldorf Astoria, to this moment where no pretending was required. When she reached him, he took her hands in his voice, steady though emotion, shimmered beneath the surface, as he told her she was not his arrangement or his image, that she was his forever. Ella's eyes glistened as she replied that she was no longer the girl who carried trays in borrowed shoes, that she was the woman who had chosen him not for his empire but for his heart, and together they vowed that there would be no more masks, no more fear, only the courage to face the world side by side. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and the courtyard filled with applause. Daniel whooped loudest of all. Alexander pulled her close and kissed her with the certainty of a man who had finally found home, the scent of roses, mingling with the taste of promises kept. In the months that followed, their life together blossomed quietly. Ella returned to school to pursue her dream of interior design. Supported by a scholarship from a foundation Alexander had established in her name, she worked late on projects sketching layouts and color schemes, while Alexander surprised her with coffee runs and gentle encouragement. He too shifted his path, moving grant holdings toward ethical investments and cultural consulting inspired by her belief that spaces and systems should uplift people, not crush them. They built not just a marriage, but a partnership, where each step forward was taken together, no longer billionaire and poor girl, but equals in purpose and devotion. One evening, as they danced barefoot in their kitchen to the scratchy sound of an old jazz record, Ella teased him about his infamous words, reminding him of that night when he had asked her to pretend to love him. Alexander laughed, pulling her closer, whispering that it had been the smartest gamble of his life. She smiled, pressing her forehead against his, and murmured that it was no longer pretending, this was real, and in that moment both knew they had crafted something stronger than wealth or reputation, something that gossip and betrayal could never touch. Their story was retold in whispers and articles, some still calling it unconventional, but to those who mattered, it was a testament to resilience and trust. And as Alexander often said during speeches, love had not saved him. In spite of his empire, it had saved him because it stripped away the empire and revealed the man beneath. Ella, too, spoke publicly for the first time at a charity gala. Months later, her voice calm and clear, as she explained that dignity and courage were not limited to any class, that sometimes the poorest girl could change the richest man, not by pretending, but by daring to be exactly who she was. The room rose to its feet in applause. Alexander, watching her with pride so fierce it nearly undid him. Their marriage became a sanctuary filled with laughter, occasional quarrels, and endless rediscovery, but above all filled with the promise they had made that day in the garden. No more pretending, only truth, only love, only a shared journey into the unknown. And when they looked back at the path that had led them there through scandal and betrayal, through pain and doubt, they knew that every crack, every twist, every fall had been necessary to carve a foundation strong enough to carry them into forever. As the sun set on the evening of their first anniversary, they returned to the very courtyard where they had spoken. Their vows alone this time, no guests, no minister, just them. Alexander lifted her hand, kissing it softly. His voice hushed as he repeated the words, "No more pretending." And Ella smiled, her eyes glimmering in the fading light as she answered, "This is real together." They swayed under the rose-covered archway, the city's hum beyond the garden walls, the stars beginning to prick the darkening sky. And in that quiet, intimate dance, they sealed the truth of their love, not as billionaire and poor girl, but as man and woman who had chosen each other against every odd. Their story, no longer about survival or scandal, but about the courage to live without masks, and the certainty that the most extraordinary endings are built not on fairy tales, but on the willingness to be real. Before you go, let me ask you something from the heart. Did Ella and Alexander's journey move you the way it moved us? While we were telling it every twist, from the dazzling gala at the Waldorf Astoria to the nights of doubt and betrayal, to the final vow whispered under roses, was written with one question in mind. What does it take to break through pride, fear, and pain to reach something real? If their story reminded you that love is not about wealth or status, but about choosing to see and to stand by each other, then I want to invite you to keep walking this path of stories with us, because here we believe in tales that stir your pulse, stories that take you from tears to laughter in a single breath, romances that remind us of the power of vulnerability and the beauty of resilience. So if you felt your heart racing when Alexander bent his pride and dropped to one knee in that cafe, if you felt the sting of Ella's humiliation when the world turned against her, if you whispered no more pretending under your breath as they finally confessed, then you are already part of this family of dreamers and believers. Your support is what allows us to keep crafting these long cinematic journeys for you. So take a second right now to subscribe, so you never miss the next tale of impossible love tested by fire. Leave us a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We read every single one, and your words inspire the stories we choose. Next, maybe you want to see a romance set on a windswept ranch, or inside the marble halls of politics. Maybe you long for a story where a poor single dad finds love with a powerful CEO, or where a forgotten artist captures the heart of someone who was never supposed to notice them. Your ideas matter, and this channel is where they can come to life. And if this particular story touched you, rate it in the comments from 0 to 10. Because your feedback shapes our craft, we promise to bring you more narratives woven with the same emotional undulation. The same blend of tension, heartbreak, and ultimate hope that you experienced here tonight. Remember, love is never about the numbers in a bank account or the size of an empire. It is about the courage to stand in front of another human being, stripped of masks, and say, "I see you and I choose you," so hit that subscribe button turn on notifications, and join us as we continue to tell stories that remind us of the truth Ella and Alexander discovered, that the greatest love stories are not the ones we pretend to live, but the ones we dare to live for real.